We are focused on our future, the future of our communities, our land, and everything that lives on it. Where others see challenges, we see opportunities. Opportunities for leadership, for innovation, for turning challenges into solutions and taking actions. We partner with landowners, governments, Indigenous leaders, and conservation-minded organizations to make real, measurable impacts on the ground. Our approach is continental, and so is our impact. We have restored or conserved over 16 million acres of North American wetlands, from the boreal forests of Canada to the prairies, from the Pacific coast to the Atlantic, and all the way down to the Gulf. And we're just getting started. Our conservation actions have resulted in stronger economies, clean water, thriving biodiversity, flood mitigation, and outdoor recreation opportunities for communities. But we couldn't do it without your support. We are ready to dedicate the full weight of our research and expertise towards solving the challenges of tomorrow. From climate change mitigation and adaptation to food security, we are taking action. We are Canada's conservation solution provider. Join us.
Canada's natural spaces are under threat. Our water and wildlife face relentless pressure. That brings uncertainty to all of us. But we're here to help. We are Ducks Unlimited Canada, and we've been conserving wetlands and helping wildlife since 1938. Our conservation philosophy begins with science, and our science brings conservation to life. The Institute for Wetland and Waterfowl Research is the research arm of Ducks Unlimited Canada. World-class researchers discover the impacts of human activity on our changing environment. They measure the value of wetlands to society. They calculate the ability of wetlands to prevent floods and droughts. They look for ways to remove pollutants from water. And in a time defined by climate change, they are looking for ways to adapt. We've been part of nearly 300 research studies across Canada, and we're developing the next generation of scientists through partnerships with more than 40 universities. The Institute for Wetland and Waterfowl Research powers Ducks Unlimited Canada's conservation work, and our science is shaping the future. Learn more today and see how you can help.
Never ever thought I'd find myself in that situation. Today was the first day I've ever touched a gun. I don't even eat red meat in general usually.
She doesn't know how she's going to respond.
I've never seen a life being taken like that.
I think the thought of killing an animal is really conflicting for her. And yeah, I'm a bit nervous about it.
Go. Hey everyone, good evening. Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited 2023 Waterfowl Season Outlook, a collaborative effort between Ducks Unlimited Canada and Ducks Unlimited Incorporated. I'm Mike Brasher, Senior Waterfowl Scientist, and I'm going to be your host for this event tonight. This is year 2, and we are thankful that you've been able to join us here tonight. During this event, we're going to, which I might add is coming to you live from Ducks Unlimited's national headquarters here in Memphis, Tennessee. We're going to dive into the results of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's recently released report on waterfowl status of 2023. We're going to discuss the ups and downs of those population estimates that came out in the report. We're going to reflect on habitat conditions that were reported in that document. We're going to offer a bit of speculation among the 4 of us, actually about 7 of us, on what might have been responsible for some of those ups and downs, and maybe what might be what may be causing those type of variations. Importantly, we're going to look forward to what this might mean for you as you enter the fall hunting season. We're also going to hear about some exciting developments coming to us from the west coast of the U.S., where we've had some pretty dramatic improvements in habitat conditions. We're also going to get an update on highly pathogenic avian influenza, which we all heard quite a bit about last year. A bit of housekeeping before we get into the discussion and I introduce my guest. We are scheduled for 2 hours for this event. We have a lot of information to cover, so we're going to try to stay on schedule. We're going to have a 5-minute break about halfway through this event, and that's going to allow everyone to kind of catch their breath, maybe refill their drink, and then we'll get back into the discussion. Second, I also want to let you know that there will be some prize giveaways tonight, and a little bit more on that here in just a moment. First, we're going to introduce our guest, and again, as I said, I'm Mike Brasher, Senior Waterfowl Scientist for Ducks Unlimited here in Memphis, and I'm going to go right here to my right.
My name is Brooke Richard. I am the Director of Marketing of Higdon Outdoors. I'm proud to represent Higdon as the official decoy of Ducks Unlimited, and proud to call Dr. Mike a friend.
Thanks, Mike. I'm Matt Dyson. I'm a research scientist focusing on waterfowl with Ducks Unlimited Canada from the Institute for Wetland and Waterfowl Research in Stonewall, Manitoba.
Ryan Callahan, Director of Conservation at Meat Eater, just another duck hunter.
We also have 2 guests joining us online right now, and I'll prompt them here to introduce themselves. Mark, go right ahead.
I'm Chief of the Branch of Migratory Bird Surveys and a pilot biologist with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Virginia.
Good evening. I'm Virginia Getz, Director of Conservation Programs for Ducks Unlimited's Western Regional Office in Rancho Cordova, California.
Thank you all. We're going to get into the prize giveaway here in just a moment. I have some instructions on that. The giveaway itself won't occur until a little bit later on. But the first thing that we wanted to start out with, a piece of news that I think will be of interest to hunters traveling north into Canada this year. Most of you might remember that last year there was an import restriction for birds harvested in Canada, brought back into the U.S. Ducks Unlimited worked with a lot of our partners across North America, and USDA, APHIS, and their office to get that import restriction revised last year to allow the importation of birds with some restrictions. We've worked with USDA, APHIS additionally this year over the past few months. We greatly appreciate the cooperation and partnership that we've developed with them, and I'm happy to report that now for hunters that go into Canada and want to bring birds back into the U.S., you can retain the skin on those birds. There's still some restrictions that you have to follow with regard to how they have to be handled and packaged and brought back in, but the skin can remain on, and I know that's an important thing for the folks that like the culinary experience of those fat ducks and the skin that it provides to our meal. So if you want to learn more about that, you can go to either the Ducks Unlimited Canada website or the Ducks Unlimited Inc. website. That's ducks.ca or ducks.org, and just search for avian flu. We each have a page dedicated to it, and you'll find on that site the link that will take you to USDA's guidelines, specific guidelines for that. So with that, I'm going to move on to some instructions for the prize packages graciously provided by our partners, including Chêne Gear, YETI, Onyx, Drake Waterfowl, Higdon Outdoors, DU Canada, and DU Inc. We're going to have 6 prize packages tonight in total, 3 given out tonight, 3 given out tomorrow. Now, importantly, to be entered into the drawing for these giveaways, you have to either scan the QR code that you're going to see on your screen, or click a link that should be in the YouTube description. So one of those two ways you'll have to register. If you registered earlier to get notifications about this event, it's important that you realize that does not enter you into the drawing. Either the link or the QR code is what you'll have to do, and we need that information in order to get in touch with you to deliver those prize packages. Brooke, I'm going to ask you to talk about the gracious offer that Higdon Outdoors made to everybody that is participating and viewing this event tonight.
Yeah, sure. So thanks, Dr. Mike. Again, thanks for having me. Higdon Outdoors, we don't ever give discount codes out, but we are the official decoy of Ducks Unlimited. We appreciate conservation, and as the official decoy of Ducks Unlimited, a percentage of the proceeds of all of our decoys goes back into the machine at Ducks Unlimited to help conservation efforts. So Dr. Mike asked me to be here, and we have a 20% discount code for anyone watching this. Enter the discount code, I believe it's DU Season Outlook. DU Season Outlook on HigdonOutdoors.com. Get 20% off, shipped right to your front door. We appreciate everybody's support of Ducks Unlimited, especially everybody here watching.
Yep, thank you, Brooke. We should have that code should be up on the screen. If not, we'll make sure that happens. And you will also receive that code in an email. We'll get that code to you somehow. But anyway, appreciate that, Brooke. Appreciate all my guests being here. Virginia, Mark, thank you all for taking the time to join us. We are going to have another guest join us at about the halfway mark, Dr. Julie Lennox with USDA APHIS. She's going to give us an update on avian flu. For now, we're going to get right into the numbers. The report was released last Friday by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and we have a presentation to go through that will highlight these numbers, and then we're going to engage in a discussion, some speculation about what was going on. I will not pretend for a moment that we're going to have all the answers to the questions that you may have, but we're going to have a good discussion about it, and hopefully help you begin to think about what it might mean or what it might not mean as you venture out in the field this year. So can we cue the PowerPoint? Here we go. First off, I do have to acknowledge that the reports here, a lot of this, I should say all of this information is going to come from these two reports, and perhaps a few others that we'll talk about though, but these are the two primary reports put out each year by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The one you see on your left is the population status report. Some of the information that we're going to be talking about relates to how those numbers affect harvest regulations. Some of the models that are used that are used for those harvest regulations are described, and data are summarized in that adaptive harvest management report. A very big thank you to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Canadian Wildlife Service, state and provincial partners for conducting the survey. This is kind of where I have to say this is not a Ducks Unlimited survey. It's not a Ducks Unlimited report. We invariably get that every year. And we take great pride in helping U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and our partners communicate the results of this survey. It's something that's highly anticipated by hunters all across North America every year. And so just absolutely give credit to the folks that conduct it and make it happen. There is a bit of nomenclature here that we'll start off with. There are two broad survey areas that we'll be talking about. The one you see there in the yellow is the traditional survey area, or we may shorthand it to TSA. The Eastern Survey is in green, the ESA. So keep that in mind. Now, we're not going to step through every single species that was surveyed and reported on in the report. You can find this particular graphic as well as another one that I'm going to show you a little bit later on at ducks.org/duck numbers. And you can dig into a bit of the comments that we've made in that regard. I do have some graphs here to highlight a few species. Total ducks. This is the number that I will admit kind of got our attention whenever we first saw this report, 32.32 million. We have had some conversations over the past year, kind of anticipating a bit of a bump from last year because there was some moisture on the prairies last year. And when we didn't see that just from this number, we got a little, it got our attention. I should say that. So it's down from last year, down from the long-term average of total ducks in that traditional survey area. Total prairie ponds. This is a measure of sort of the habitat conditions in that prairie landscape, which is so responsible for those annual up and down fluctuations. The boreal forest, which we'll talk about, is pretty stable from year to year, but the prairies is a landscape that when it changes and gets wet, it can really crank out some ducks, and so they count ponds up there. Both measures from the perspective of, relative to last year as well as the long-term average down a little bit. We might dig into some of the details on how that varied across that landscape as we go. Mallard is, of course, the bird that pretty much everyone's going to be interested in, down 18% from last year, now down 23% from the long-term average. I guarantee you we'll be talking about that one here in the next little while. Pintail, this was another one that everyone had an eye on coming into this year because last year was the lowest count on record. This year we did see a 24% increase from last year, but still 43% below that long-term average. A lot of reasons for that. Might get into some of that discussion as we go forward tonight. American widgeon, primarily a boreal nesting species, 1.89 million, down 14% from last year, now down 28% from the long-term average. You dig into the data, you find a couple of areas where that decline was pretty stark. We might get into that discussion as well. Green-winged teal was a bright spot, up 16% from last year, now up 15% from its long-term average. It's another boreal nester. You will see from the graph that it has declined from sort of the peak years of around 2015, 2016, and that's probably another thing that we're going to talk about. Most of these species that you're going to look at will be coming down from that recent peak. Blue-winged teal is one that I think surprised a little bit, surprised a number of people because we were expecting a fair bit of production. The breeding population size from this year is down 19% from last year. This is probably a good place for me to kind of pause and remind folks the numbers we're talking about here are the numbers that were estimated during the spring breeding season. This is a breeding population, not the number of birds that we're going to necessarily see coming south. These are the birds that were there to breed. So there's a number of things that go into producing this breeding population size, and that includes the number of birds that bred last year, the production that happened last year, and then those that would have made it through the winter. Nevertheless, still up from the long-term average, but down from last year, and was a surprise to a number of people. Canvasbacks, up from last year and kind of even with the long-term average. Whenever we see these percentages like 5%, 6%, something like that, probably you can say that's about unchanged from last year from a statistical standpoint, from the scientist's perspective. We have a few other things here to share with you. Great Lakes mallards, if you take the states of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, you can look at those birds as a very important resource for hunters of those states, down 13% from last year, down 44% from the long-term average. There's a lot of work going on to try to understand some of what's happening with those declines. Western mallards, combined across the states of Alaska, province of British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, and California. The Alaska count was down 38%. When you look at those other states, it was up 4% from 2022. The total western mallard total that you see in that graph there was down from last year. I don't have a percentage on that, but this is important because this influences harvest regulations for folks in the Pacific Flyway. And Eastern Survey area, we have a couple of slides related to that. Again, you can find all these numbers on the Ducks Unlimited website. Mallard. Folks that hunt in the Atlantic Flyway will know that this bird has, I guess, a couple of years ago had a harvest restriction, bag limit restriction on it down to 2 birds. Last year, well, actually, it's this year that they're going back to 4 birds, a 4-bird daily bag limit. Happy to report that the change from last year to this year was very minor. The estimate is 1.2 million. We're going to talk here in a bit about what that means for projections for harvest regulations for next year. That's another little thing that we'll have to clarify. Black ducks, another favorite species in the east, up 8% from last year, up from its long-term average. That's a good thing to see. And wood duck, there is a way that the Fish and Wildlife Service and partners can estimate population size for wood ducks, which is no small feat. And the estimate this year is about 1 million, which was up a little bit from the long-term average, similar to last year. So I think that is where we're going to stop with the slideshow, and I'm going to kick it right to Mark Koneff for his reaction. Mark, I guess before you do that, I want you to provide a bit of perspective on kind of your work within the service, or I guess just briefly why I might be throwing this question to you. You are chief of the branch of harvest surveys. Tell us how long you've been doing these surveys, and then I want you to give your kind of perspective on the results of the survey when you saw them.
Yeah, sure, Mike. And thanks again for having me this evening. So I'm chief of the branch of Migratory Bird Surveys. And so our branch is composed primarily of the pilot biologists that many of your listeners, viewers might be familiar with. Our primary role is in coordinating and delivering many of our very large-scale migratory bird surveys in the continent, including the various aerial surveys that we conduct to support waterfowl management, as well as our operational banding programs. And then prior to this position with the service, I was the chief of our assessment branch for a number of years back in Laurel, Maryland, where I dealt a little bit more with AHM and some of the technical support for the regulatory process, and worked a little bit as well for about a decade, actually, on habitat conservation planning and evaluation under the NAWAMP. So I've been a pilot biologist with the service for about 25 years and with the migratory bird program in total for about 31 years.
Hey, Mark, I'm going to interrupt you right there. Can we get Mark on our screen here? We are live. There we go. All right, so we got you, Mark. So your reaction whenever you saw the numbers, what did you think? Were you surprised? You've been doing this for a long time.
Yeah, I guess I'd say overall that I didn't see anything too surprising. There were a few small items in there that took me by a little bit of surprise, but I didn't really expect a large swing in populations either up or down. So to me, the numbers were fairly in line with expectations. I mean, we had the widespread drought in 2020, 2021, the prairies and the West. And frankly, conditions last year, I mean, they weren't stellar in many areas, especially the Western prairies. And even in the Eastern prairies, even though the pond counts had increased in some areas, a lot of that water, especially seasonal wetlands, wasn't super productive for ducks. I mean, we saw a lot of seasonal basins that had been plowed under, during the drought years, and they had become really kind of just big mud puddles. There really wasn't a whole lot of cover around them. There wasn't a whole lot of utilization. In some areas last year in the eastern prairies, the rain came a little bit too late. We saw lots of unoccupied habitat in some areas. So I guess maybe with all that and then sort of the lag effect in the population sizes that you might expect coming off a couple of years of pretty significant drought, it wasn't all that surprising to me to see populations that were close to last year, maybe slightly reduced. In fact, last fall when we had our fall regulatory meetings, we had projected, again, just based on observations during the spring survey and tracking habitat conditions throughout the summer, that production from the prairies as a whole would be relatively fair last year. So this year, again, it's kind of dry in a lot of the areas in the prairies, especially in the West. There are some bright spots. Eastern South Dakota looked good, pretty good. Much of North Dakota was looking in good shape, and Western South Dakota also looked in pretty good shape. We have had some questions about some of the estimates out of Alaska for some species. I was maybe a little bit surprised that there was as low in some areas as they were. We are coming off of pretty extreme drought in the West. Certainly that's probably a contributing factor. It may be also a little bit of phenology. I might have contributed to things a little bit this year. We had a later spring in Alaska, and we had a very early spring, almost unprecedentedly early spring across the Northwest Territories and a lot of the bush in the mid-continent. And the numbers for many species were up generally in those areas. So we may have just encountered a lot of those birds, farther south in the bush than Alaska. So that's sort of in a nutshell. If I had to sum it up, that's where I'd land.
Appreciate that, Mark. Matt, you and I have talked a lot about over the past few days about kind of the habitat conditions last year and then this year in the prairies mostly. Kind of share some of your thoughts, some of what we've heard, some of what is similar to what Mark was talking about.
Yeah, I mean, a lot similar to what Mark was talking about. I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there, Mark. With we saw some bright conditions maybe early in the spring, some water back on the prairies in some instances, particularly there in 2022. But that water didn't really stick around in a lot of cases where we saw a lot of drying happen out, and that's where we need that for production because our broods, That's when those ducklings are going to be out on the landscape. We need water, we need escape cover for them, food. And so we've still kind of been lacking that. And so we're really looking at quite an extended period now, in general, across the prairies. We've been in a few years of drought, and until we can really get out of there and get a few years where we've got a lot of water back on the landscape, we're not probably going to see those highs of, years like 2015 when we kind of saw the peak of mallard numbers and a lot of that production on that landscape.
Cal, you had an excellent question earlier. I think it was you that asked us about kind of when the peak, what was it?
Well, yeah, these kind of dovetail together because our original question is, are we seeing birds move out of survey areas, out of traditional survey areas because of how they've been affected by drought? Or, for the same reason, other areas are holding a lot more water right now. So are the survey areas that we have just less productive, and those birds are existing in other spots. And then to your point about we have mud puddles that, yes, they're wet. They are in our pond surveys, but how productive are they? When is like peak productivity for an intermittent wetland? Is it when it first fills up? Is it the second season that it holds water, the third season? What is the ideal habitat?
Well, I'm not, if that question's for me, I'm not a wetland ecologist in the prairies, but, just from our experience, I would say it's going to take a couple of seasons of wet, for the emergence to be restored, to have the productivity back to that basin. I mean, that first year when it gets wet right after it's been plowed for a year or two, I mean, literally there's just no cover. There's no cover around the basin. There's really little vegetation within the basin. It takes maybe a season or so for that seed bank to reactivate and really restore the productivity of the basin.
Mark, that was exactly my and Matt's take on that, and we went back to some of what we've read from the classic study program conducted there at the Delta Waterfowl Research Station 20, 30 years ago, probably more like 30, 40 years ago, the Marsh Ecology Research Program, and they were testing some of those very things during the, trying to understand that prairie wetland cycle and the ecology of it. How long does it take for those invertebrate communities to come back after we get water back on it? And the one thing that makes a lot of this landscape different, as you talked about, is that when it dries up, it gets farmed. And yeah, it takes that, what that research program discovered is that it doesn't take very long for those nutrients to be recharged and then the invertebrates to return if there's that intact vegetation community, right? And so when we've got these wetlands in these agricultural landscapes that get farmed and plowed when they're dried, it does take a couple of years. And we really haven't seen that, right? So.
No, and one of the things we're also interested now, and we talk about that study 30, 40 years ago, we also know conditions have changed a lot in that time period since those studies. And so one of the questions that we're interested in continuing to ask is, how are these current wetlands conditions responding when the water comes back? What sort of ecosystem function do they actually serve?
Yeah, and the seasonality and how we participate in this system of migratory birds, right? From the hunter's perspective, a mud puddle in a grain stubble field, is still a very good thing to see because it's probably going to have some food there. But when we shift our focus to breeding, nesting, having that cover for young to escape from overhead predators or just have some security there isn't something that I'm thinking about when I'm looking out on the landscape. I mean, I'm not sure if maybe our friends at Higdon feel the same way too, right? So
yeah, I mean, it's, the cool thing is Cal and I are kind of in the same boat. We're not doctors. We're here from a duck hunter's perspective.
We're not real doctors. Let's be clear about that, too.
There's a reason. I've got a lot of papers in front of me, and
right.
He's got it all in his head. But, the biggest thing for me is, I'm a redneck, I'm going to be honest. And at the end of the day, I'm involved with Ducks Unlimited, and I care about all this, and it matters. But, what do these numbers really mean to me? It's a lot of data. There's a lot of factors. I live here in Western Kentucky, originally from Lafayette, Louisiana. I don't spend my summers in the prairie pothole region, whether it's the boreal forest area or it's North America's breeding ground. I don't see what that habitat looks like. I assume I'd like to know what, mallard ducks, puddle ducks, diver ducks like to breed in, to live in whenever they're not flying through the flooded timber in western Kentucky. But at the end of the day, I don't know. But these numbers provide us with intel, and you flying around in Canada paints that picture for us to understand and say, hey, here's what's going on and here's what matters. So having these conversations is super, super helpful for folks like me, and I'm sure there's at least one person watching this that's not a doctor that this is going to help. And that's the big thing for me is paying attention to what's going on is the right thing to do. Whether you understand the data or if you're like me, you don't understand the data, you just know it matters. These questions really spark the conversation of what can we do better. Yeah. So it's interesting. It's a lot of information. Mike did a good job sending me homework, but a lot of really good stuff.
Have you been to the prairies during the breeding, during the summer?
I've not. No.
We'll have to fix that. I know you've been in the fall, and you're going back this year.
He's got an airplane. I'm going with Mark.
It's a good thing. Let's see. We have a few other things that I know we wanted to talk with you about, Mark. We could, as I was telling folks, we have great guests. All of us have experiences. We could be here for 6 hours if we wanted to. We have a few questions that we wanted to run by you. We know that your time here with us tonight is limited, so want to take advantage of that. Cal, I think question about maybe you have for Mark. You got it, or you want me to get it?
No, it is. I mean, it's still back to the data. And Virginia, obviously, you're more than welcome to chime in here too. Is how important is this data? Like, I appreciate that it exists. For me, it's certainly something I can point to as a validation of our license system, our stamp system. That we're paying for data, but what do people like me do with this data?
Sure. So this survey in particular, this is one of sort of three foundational monitoring programs that form the basis of modern waterfowl management. The other two being our banding programs and harvest surveys. And you might have heard of all three of these programs sort of being referred to as the three legs of the stool kind of modern waterfowl management. So this survey data, the Waterfowl Breeding Population and Habitat Survey, or BPOP survey, it rolls off the tongue a little bit better. It's really important in a couple of ways. I mean, first, this very long annual time series of data that we've developed now through this survey, going way back into the 1950s in the western regions, traditional survey area that Mike mentioned, it really has allowed us to build the models that provide insight into how waterfowl populations change in response to the environment, how they change in response to weather, short-term weather fluctuations, and human actions like hunting. And so some of those models have become kind of core elements of AHM. So it allows us to have this kind of predictive insight into waterfowl population change. So secondly, then, the data that we collect each year with this survey, it really plays a key role in selecting the actual regulations that are eventually recommended through the harvest strategies like adaptive harvest management strategies. And so within AHM, the survey and other monitoring data, they provide us estimates of what sort of the current state of things. What are the size of breeding populations? What is the condition of key breeding habitats? And then we can feed those data into the models where we can allow us to identify the best set of regulations for a given set of conditions relative to our desire to achieve a certain set of harvest management objectives that are stated up front and agreed to by all parties. And so, also part of AHM, the annual monitoring data allows us to compare the predictions that the models made with the actual survey data. And so that allows us to identify which models predict best, and that allows us to factor the predictions of those models more heavily into future decisions. So we kind of weight those models more heavily in future decision making, and that's really sort of the learning component of AHM. I guess maybe one last point I'd make to that question is that, we know that our understanding of waterfowl population dynamics is not perfect. If it was perfect, we wouldn't need models. We wouldn't need a lot of these processes. There's uncertainty. There's always going to be uncertainty. It's an extremely complicated system. But that's really the beauty of AHM as a process for making decisions. It's kind of designed to make reasonable decisions, even in the face of that uncertainty. And so it's a transparent process, or the rules of the game are established up front, negotiated up front by the service and by the states. And then, so that's really why there's so much interest in these survey results from year to year, because the rules are already established for at least some species and populations. And the AHM season recommendations are going to be determined by the survey results. Now, that doesn't mean that the recommendations from AHM are the only thing that the decision makers consider when making final selections of the seasons. But typically, the season, unless there's some other major confounding issue, the season framework that's recommended by AHM is what ends up being selected and approved by the assistant secretary.
And quick follow up here, we talk about these big landscape level, major changes that affect these numbers: wildfires, droughts, disease outbreaks. Changing in agricultural practices, big things. Do the birds that me and my yellow lab take really matter?
Well, that's certainly there are varying responses to that question. However, and there is in fact models within the AHM system that sort of codify the range of professional opinion and scientific understanding of how that process works. The degree to which harvest is additive versus compensatory or compensated by other forms of natural mortality. And so that's one answer to that question. It depends on how much it matters, depends on the model and the conditions of that year. I guess the other point I would make about like big changes that you're talking about is they're important from another perspective too, in that AHM, when we developed the model set initially, was founded on the premise that the past is a good predictor of the future. And so, we used a lot of or people that are much smarter than me, used a lot of the variation that we'd seen in the past in these large systems to help inform our predictions of the future. Under potential climate change, other large system changes in agricultural policy that have really large scale consequences, potentially over rapid timeframes. That's a challenge for any decision making protocol, and there's a lot of very smart people that are working on that issue. They as far as how to make good decisions in the face of that kind of they call it more deep uncertainty that kind of where the future or the past may not be as good a predictor of the future.
Cal, if you and your yellow lab are planning on coming out here to California to hunt this year, there's a couple things in that survey data that might catch your eye. California hunters have to be pleased by the 24% increase in pintail numbers, because out here in the Pacific Flyway, the pintail is king. If you're a rice field hunter, you're going to be very disappointed by the drop in widgeon numbers, because widgeon, green-winged teal, and pintail are the primary birds that are harvested in the rice. And then finally, I would say the low breeding counts in Alaska could be of concern, depending on the role of survey chronology, as Mark mentioned, because many of our birds out here come from Alaska.
I did see shoveler numbers are way up over there, though.
They're way up, yeah. They're way up.
She'll like those.
She doesn't discriminate. The lab doesn't discriminate on those.
Neither do I, really.
Yeah, that's right. There's nothing wrong with that. Appreciate that.
Cal, you mentioned too the wildfires in terms of being a potential big landscape influencer, and it's that's one of the questions we get most often, especially this year with significant amount and acres being burned this year in Canada's boreal forest, and certainly would be remiss too if we don't acknowledge here. I think as well thoughts to the folks in Yellowknife and Kelowna and those communities that have been evacuated here and the communities that continue to be evacuated here. So certainly thinking about those folks and hope they're doing okay. But in general, we've been able to use this type of data, like from the BPOP that we collect, and look at historic effects of wildfires because we have tracking mechanisms to monitor different amounts of wildfire on those transects. And historically, duck populations have appeared to be fairly resilient to a lot of these wildfires and adapted, particularly in the boreal forest. However, we haven't seen the severity and the extent of a lot of these fires, and so I think there's some new questions or opportunities potentially to really start to understand some how these potential new landscape drivers are influencing populations, sort of as Mark alluded to here. If there's can be some uncertainty and learning that has to happen in these models all the time. So that'll be something we're tracking.
It's a constant in the fact that fire has always been on the landscape, but how intense and for how long?
Yeah, the frequency and severity is definitely changing, and that might take some time to look at that again.
Do we have any expectation that any of the patterns we might have seen in the survey results, and this is for you, Matt, or Mark, for you, any of the results that we may have seen could have been measurably influenced by any of those fires? Do we have any sense of that? Either of you? Mark, I spoke with you about this a little while ago, like in terms of the fire, whether you encountered fires, and any of your experiences over the past number of years just with kind of revisiting some of those fire-affected areas.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so as far as the impact of the fires on the survey this year, we in the East, we didn't really see any impact. The fires in Quebec, Ontario, and the Atlantic provinces really didn't kick into high gear until after we really just completed the survey. Out west, maybe a little bit different story. Our crews especially our crews in Alberta and the Northwest Territories, they had areas of the survey that were definitely impacted by the fires where we couldn't fly either due to the fires themselves or due to suppression efforts. And really all the Western crews right through Prairie, Manitoba, they were all affected by smoke and poor visibility. I mean, visibility was so poor at times that we had to terminate the survey. Just difficult to spot towers and power lines. As far as insights on impact of fire on ducks, I mean, I'm familiar with some of the historic literature on that with kind of conflicting results. My personal experiences flying a lot in the East, the duck densities are so much lower that it's kind of difficult to draw any contrasts. I've talked to our pilots about it, especially those that fly more extensively in the West, and I think the general sense is that populations may be slightly depressed right after fires, but tend to rebuild and maybe even exceed the levels before the fire a few years after, which maybe a lot of reasons why that might occur. But again, that's all kind of anecdotal observations. We don't have any hard data on that.
We may come back to that conversation a little bit later on, but like I knew would happen, we have quickly eaten up all of the time that we had set aside for you, Mark, and then some. So you're welcome to stick around if you have other things that you have to do this evening. I'm sure you do, but you're welcome to stick around with us and enjoy the party. But we do want to thank you for joining us. Thank you for everything that you've done as a pilot, flying, observing, and in your role as the chief of that branch. We greatly appreciate it, and that I say that to you as well as every man and woman that's in your branch and that's responsible for all this. So appreciate it, man.
Well, thank you very much. We appreciate the partnership with DU and everyone here. I hope you guys have a great event, and look forward to talking to you soon.
We'll catch up later. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
And I think right now it's the Virginia Getz show. We're going to talk about some of the massive improvements in habitat conditions out west over the past year. This is another conversation that we could have for an hour. We're going to try to avoid that. Virginia, give us, I guess, a bit of the rundown on kind of how things are out there. And then I think Cal has a few questions for you, too, with the way things have shaped up. But just sort of the big rundown on what changed from last year to this year.
Let me start by describing where we've been out west in terms of precipitation and habitat conditions, because it provides an important context for where we are currently. During water year 2019-2020 through water year 21-22, the West endured 3 consecutive years of extreme drought. We entered summer of 2022 with California in severe to exceptional drought. Oregon was in abnormally dry to extreme drought conditions, and Washington was abnormally dry to moderate drought conditions. This was the driest 3-year period on record in California. And headed into last fall, conditions on the important staging areas in southern Oregon and northeastern California, which is referred to as the Sonic area, and the primary wintering grounds in California's Central Valley were the worst that I've ever seen. Water deliveries to wetland areas were reduced, and planted rice acreage in the Sacramento Valley was reduced by 25%. And of the acreage that was planted, only about 17% of those planted acres were flooded after harvest. So that's about an 80% less post-harvest flooded rice fields than we would normally see down here. Rice fields that are flooded after harvest, they provide important foraging areas for wintering waterfowl, and many of those flooded rice fields also provide waterfowl hunting opportunities. So the reduction in wetland habitat in rice also meant a reduction in waterfowl hunting opportunities on both public and private land. So that was kind of setting the stage for going into this last winter. And weather whiplash has kind of become more of the norm out west, and we're seeing these big swings in wet and dry cycles more frequently. Winter 22-23 delivered record amounts of precipitation in California, with rainfall amounts exceeding 150% of normal and snowpack exceeding 200% of normal in some locations. So we went from bone dry to water spreading all over the landscape. And all but the extreme northeast and southeast portions of California came out of drought by May of 2023. Thanks to the generous snowpack and the resulting runoff, California's major reservoirs were filled going into the 2023 growing season. Winter was not quite as kind to Oregon and Washington. They were about 70 to 100% of normal precip. But overall, spring habitat conditions in 2023 improved significantly over 2022 in all 3 states.
So Virginia, what can we say about, let's say, breeding population numbers? We've already kind of touched on those a little bit, but do we have any information for other states, anything like that?
Yeah, our total waterfowl breeding populations in California, they increased by 30% from 2022, but they remained 8% below long-term average. Our three main breeders here are mallard, gadwall, cinnamon teal. Mallards increased by 13%, but they remain 38% below the long-term average. Gadwall increased by 16%, and they're 2% above the long-term average. I'm not going to give you shoveler numbers because those just went through the roof. But cinnamon teal increased by 45%, but they remain about 21% below the long-term average. So although the breeding habitat conditions improved in 2023, there are factors other than drought that are influencing duck production in the Central Valley. Overall clean farming combined with conversion of grain crops to orchards, the lack of agricultural set-aside and cover crop programs has limited suitable upland nesting cover, and reliable brood water is also very limited. So it's going to take some major changes on the landscape to help return breeding populations to the long-term average.
A bunch of stuff I'd love to ask you. So One interesting thing that we were discussing earlier is I saw canvasback numbers in your area seem to be way high, while some of the other diver species that we concentrate on, like scaup and ringbill, seem to be low, and that seemed to strike me as odd because those birds, from a hunter perspective, seem to run the same patterns, fast diver ducks, and I just had to ask why that is. Is the canvasback just a different type of nester than the scaup and ringbills?
Yeah, and cans may have benefited, from conditions in Nevada, and so on and so forth. So we had some good conditions out west, and they may have benefited from that in some of those marshes.
The other thing, was this one that we were talking about where it was like,
break down because margin of
what
error.
was the number? Like, was it 9,000 or
Yeah,
something?
plus or
And the
minus
standard error was
5,000.
plus or minus 5,000. So that's kind of where we have to say,
Yes.
okay,
Yeah.
but it's, and you get that in a lot of these surveys. And it doesn't mean the data's not valuable, but it just means that, it's some, when you have birds that are low in number, scattered out, you get very high estimates of variation. Your confidence in that single number is a little lower than, just the overall trend. And so, yeah.
Yeah, there was only 4,145 cans counted in the California Breeding Population Survey, so it's a pretty small number.
Yeah, that's a big state for
Yeah.
4,100 birds to spread out in. Yeah.
Exactly.
Virginia, talk about the importance of those locally produced birds. I speak with folks every now and then, and when I discuss breeding waterfowl in Canada or in California, a lot of them aren't really aware, number one, that there is a fairly large breeding population of ducks in California, but they also aren't aware how important those locally produced birds are for California hunters. And the same could be said for any of those other states out there. But talk about that a little bit, just the importance of those locally produced birds.
Well, most of the mallards harvested in California are birds that are raised locally, basically. So breeding populations are really important, for the hunter bag, especially related to mallards. Gadwall numbers are up. The survey doesn't show them up very high, but I think, most people would say that the observations are gadwall numbers are growing. That can be a duck for hunters to harvest that seems to be doing pretty well out here. And our cinnamon teal, we see those birds come back through late in the season. Most of those birds are on their way back. It'd be the January towards the end of the season, probably when most of those birds are harvested.
Cal?
Well, yeah, I think when we talk about how important, breeding birds in California is to California bird hunters, we have to talk about that water management issue that you brought up earlier. And, what is, with this seeming abundance of water, what is going on in that Klamath area? Why do we see low water to almost no water in certain refuge systems? Can you give us any insight there?
Yeah, well, the drought, as I mentioned, all of California except the extreme northeast part of the state and the southeast part of the state came out of drought, this past winter. The northeast part of the state where Klamath is and southern Oregon did not come out of drought. They're still overall dry. So conditions not good there, but you've got a super complicated water situation in the Klamath Basin, where we've got not enough water for farming, special status fish species, and waterfowl. And the refuges, the way the water rights and priorities line up, the refuges are at the bottom of that list, So this is a bigger issue that's having an effect on not only breeding habitat, but, spring staging and fall staging habitat as well. And we're looking, last year, There was no hunting on those refuges for the first time ever. There was just no water. And we're looking at about the same situation this year. Very, very dry conditions, and what that means, from a hunting standpoint, obviously, it certainly reduces the opportunities and the bird numbers up there. But we also have seen over the last couple of years higher numbers of, say, green-winged teal and widgeon birds that typically show up in the valley a little bit later. We're seeing higher numbers of those birds by the beginning of the season. And I think they're just pushing down earlier because there's no place to stop up there.
Sure. Is there, and this is a slight tangent, is there an action we as hunters or Ducks Unlimited members can take to weigh in on that Klamath situation that you're aware of?
Yeah, I mean, DU has been working at this hard for a long time to try to get to a long-term solution, and it is very complicated. I mean, we could talk all night about that. But, in general, we have to work with all the stakeholders that are there, and there are plenty of them. There's tribal interests that have water rights. There's the farming, community there. And of course, there's wildlife as well.
Yeah, endangered species, federally and
and
state
endangered fish.
Species,
And you've got a biological opinion that, is for fish that's keeping water in the upper lake at a certain level to try to help support those fish populations, and that means that water's not coming down, to the refuges. So we have been working with the refuges for a long time. We've got a couple major projects out there to help them try to make the best use of the limited water that is available, to use it most efficiently and effectively for habitat management with some big infrastructure upgrades.
Appreciate that, Virginia. Virginia, are you able to stick around with us for a little while?
Yes.
All right. I think what we want to do now, I think we'll take our break. I think we'll take our mid-break. We'll have Virginia back, and we'll get on the other side of the break. We'll be joined by Dr. Julie Lennox. We'll hear about avian flu. Then I think we're going to talk about geese a little bit, but then we'll have an opportunity to kind of get back into some of this discussion. Virginia, I want one of the things that we still need kind of from you is like, what do we need to anticipate for prospects this fall? And so if you're able to stick around for a bit, we'll touch on that. Before we go to the break, I want to let people know, remind folks that if you want to participate in the prize giveaway, you're either going to have to scan the QR code or click the link in the description of the YouTube video, and you can enter for one of the 6 prize packages that we've got, giving away 3 tonight, giving away 3 tomorrow. There will be a question and answer session. I guess we'll take a few questions, I guess is the way to say it, because we're going to use some of that time at the last 30 minutes of this to just have our general discussion. What are we looking forward to? What is exciting Brooke Richard and the ducks and geese that he's going to be chasing? Maybe even where you're going, some of that kind of stuff.
You never know.
That's right. I also do want to, we'll have a quick discussion about the number one question that I've gotten from folks is like, well, what do these numbers mean for harvest regulations? Are we going to be given the decrease in the mallard number, are we going to be going to a restrictive season or a moderate season? We don't want to leave that totally ignored. We'll provide some context to that. We can share some of what we've learned from that AHM report that's out there. So we got a lot of information yet to come. I also want to give a thanks to all the other folks that are in this room tonight that you're not seeing, but that have been absolutely crucial and are continuing to be crucial in making this happen here tonight. I have a longer list of people to thank on the back end of this, but tonight we have working behind the scenes Carolyn Koshaluk from Ducks Unlimited Canada. We have here in the room with us Mallory Murphy, Chris Isaac, Bobby Meeks, Clay Baird, Zach Eshelman, Scott Anderson. I think I got everybody, right? All right. So they're the ones that you can't see, but without them, you wouldn't see us. So, and that might be a better thing sometimes. But anyway, we're going to go to break now, and we'll be back with you in about 5 minutes. Thanks, everyone.
In this episode of DU Nation, we take a ride with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as they conduct this year's waterfowl breeding population and habitat survey. These surveys began in 1947, and they are a collaborative effort between the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Canadian Wildlife Service, and state and provincial wildlife agencies. Their primary purpose is to provide information on the spring population, size, and trajectory of 19 North American duck species, Canada geese, American coot, and swans, and to evaluate habitat conditions by counting waterfowl breeding ponds.
So we're about ready to start here in Jamestown, North Dakota this morning. We've been down for 2 days for rain. Prior to that, we made pretty good progress. The overall conditions this year are looking pretty good. Sky's clear, winds are calm, and should be a good observation morning.
The survey is conducted from the ground and the air over a 2 million square mile area covering North America's principal breeding areas. This includes parts of Alaska, Canada, and the north central U.S.
The surveys are extremely important from the perspective, of course, of setting waterfowl seasons each and every year, and having those long-term data sets let us see what's going on as far as different populations, increases, decreases over time, as well as the habitat, what the habitat's doing. But from a perspective of Ducks Unlimited, it's also extremely important because this allows us to kind of set our conservation management planning strategies. It lets us know where areas are being heavily used by waterfowl, which habitats are extremely important. So there's always a lot of excitement around the surveys when they're coming out. People want to know what's going on. What's the fall flight going to look like for hunters? But they also want to know, they really care about what waterfowl populations are doing, and they feel good about the work that they are able to do.
Transects, as we call them, and each of the transects is broken into 18-mile segments. And we're counting everything we see out 200 meters from the airplane. We start online and we'll begin, my observer will count out the right side of the airplane and I'll count out the left side of the airplane as I'm flying. And as we go down each segment, we're looking out 200 meters and we're trying to count every duck or goose that we see, and we classify them as singles, pairs, or flock drakes. So we're looking, pair counts is the big thing. It's a breeding waterfowl survey. So we're looking for pairs of all the different species. We're looking for all this, anything that we see, and we count them, but it's a pair count mainly. Obviously, the biggest challenge we have while we're flying the survey is we fly the survey between 100 and 150 feet above ground level. And the biggest challenge we have are the obstacles that are out there. There's towers and power lines and net towers, cell towers, old UHF TV antennas, you name it, and those are all taller than what we fly. So we're constantly vigilant for that kind of object that basically will do great harm to us. So certain ducks will get in the reeds, certain ones are small, sun glare, the way the sun's glaring off the water any given morning makes the species incredibly difficult to call sometimes. So then on certain segments that are representative of the habitat that we're flying over, we have a ground crew, a 4-person ground crew that will walk out, and they will actually walk every wetland all the way down that 18 miles. The assumption being that they're seeing everything, and it corrects our numbers for the difficulties we have flying at 90 knots and 150 feet and getting one shot to count the sloop. So.
Yep, another pair of scaup drake, mallard drake, pair blue-winged teal.
This is my 15th year flying the surveys now, and probably the most fascinating thing I've seen doing this is just the wet-dry cycles. You know, the duck numbers go up and down, as I always call them. They're a commodity, kind of like corns or soybeans. If we have a lot of water, we have a lot of ducks. If we don't have a lot of water, we don't have a lot of ducks. But seeing the landscape changes just with annual precipitation variation, and then the agricultural practices over the years, a lot of tile drainage, a lot of wetland drainage, a lot of subdivisions on the landscape now, a lot of wind turbines on the landscape now. Just all that stuff certainly impacts the waterfowl habitat. And so those are, over the 15 years of flying these surveys, I think that's the biggest thing I've noticed. Just how much more in tune I got to the precipitation cycles and then just what's going on the landscape. It's pretty amazing to see what we're doing to the landscape from a duck's perspective.
Welcome back, everyone. That was a quick break, quickest 5 minutes in history, I think. But we're here. and we're glad you're back with us. Thanks for the comments, the questions that are coming in. If you do have a question that you want us to field, put it in the comment section of the YouTube. I will say we can't get to all of them, and you're probably going to put some in there that we can't answer either. So just give it your best shot, and we'll give it ours. We are going to start right back up with a report on highly pathogenic avian influenza. It was something that I know Brooke saw quite a bit. Cal, you might have, I don't know if you saw any of it or not. Did you encounter it when you were out there?
I don't think I personally did, no, but have certainly talked to a lot of folks out there who did, I mean, not, like a widespread situation, but what struck me was that the people who did encounter diseased animals or perceived that the animals were diseased were very impacted by it, and all very seasoned waterfowl people. So they don't like seeing sick animals.
Yeah, that's for sure. And Matt, I don't think you encountered it very much in Canada either, did you?
No, not too much.
Yeah. Well,
there was plenty in
Arkansas.
Yeah,
right.
I mean Arkansas, even Kentucky, I'm sure Louisiana as well, but predominantly, we're experienced with it. You'll go and see a handful if you, pre-season, duck season, you'll go put your decoys out, you'll bump up a bunch of snow geese, you'll see one or two out in the field. It was a little bit different this last year, so you could tell, and again, I am not waterfowl biologist or, any study of animal influenza, but you could tell something was different this year, but it looks like it ran its course. I'm not sure. I'll let you guys discuss it, but yeah, there was plenty of it in Arkansas this year. That's
a great segue. We're going to find out what is the status of it. Joining us remotely, Julie, let me just say, it's really a shame that you can't be here with us. We have had pretty much everything go wrong that could go wrong. We are without plumbing. We're without AC right now. It's 115 outside today. I am so sorry that you couldn't make it here to join us in person.
You're really selling it. You're really selling the trip.
Yeah, I know. And as it is, you have to be stuck in Fort Collins, Colorado, right? So
that's where I am stuck, in Fort Collins, Colorado.
Which is very hot, but dry.
It is hot. I think we might have reached a record temp today, 99 here, but it's not as humid as you are. I'm not complaining.
Yeah, guarantee you that. But Julie, let's get started. Introduce yourself to our audience, and why is it that we would have brought you onto this?
Thanks. I think you're looking for an update and a forecast is what you're looking for. I'm Julie Lennox. I'm the lead of the National Wildlife Disease Program for APHIS Wildlife Services. So I work for the USDA, and our team of wonderful disease biologists in the field implement and collect the samples for wild bird surveillance for avian influenza.
And Julie, you and I have spoken, half a dozen or dozen times over the past year. I remember our first conversation. We weren't exactly sure how it was going to go, right? But no, since then we have developed quite the partnership around this really important issue, and we thank you for everything that you and your agency has done, sharing the information with us, and allowing us to sort of be a conduit for that information out to the waterfowl hunters, which are probably they're one of the most intriguing parts of our human community that are intersecting this issue of avian influenza. Obviously, our commercial poultry operators, our backyard poultry owners, they're affected by it, but also waterfowl hunters are affected by it. They're encountering it out there in the field. So there's a lot of importance, a lot of interest in that. So we wanted you to give us a quick update on it. What did we learn from the outbreak last year? We're not going to go through all the disease epidemiology. Folks can go to the Ducks Unlimited podcast and find all sorts of episodes about that. We've spoken with a number of disease ecologists, including Julie. So what did we learn last year, and what do we have any idea that it would have affected from like a significant level any wild bird populations?
It's a great question. And as your panel alluded to, this is different, right? This is different than what we've seen in 2015 or in past outbreaks. The last year and a half have been pretty rough. I mean, all around. Commercial poultry, like you said, but many different wild bird species. I think on our reporting page, we're soundly over 7,000 detections right now in the United States. It's widespread in multiple different bird groups. We've had everything from geese and ducks and swans to raptors, eagles. A lot of the birds of prey have taken some hit on this, probably because they're taking advantage of an easy lunch, a sick or dead bird, and they're scavenging on that. So I don't think right now we've had, we've certainly had large die-offs, as your folks have said. The snow geese, Ross's geese, some of those have taken pretty big mortality events, but there are a lot of them. So at this point, I don't think we're going to expect a huge population level effect in any of our birds. Thankfully, we should get some reproduction going on. And as Virginia said, we've got lots of pintails out there still. The mallard population looks pretty good. I just came back from a trip to Alaska to help our crew up there. Well, help. I don't know if I helped really, but I went along with them at least, and got to be involved with some sampling that were going on. It remains to be seen really what we see as far as this virus changing over time. We know we've had 6 different introductions into the United States, some from the Pacific flyway, some from the Atlantic. Other countries have reported pretty large seabird colony, effects and shorebirds. We have not seen that yet in North America. So good to remain vigilant. We do appreciate the input we've gotten from hunters and, the reports of the die-off, so we can relay that information to our state wildlife folks and make sure people get out there and submit those samples if need be. But I think we just need to remain vigilant going into fall and winter and certainly ahead of the fall migration.
Now, Julie, what can you tell us about any recent surveillance efforts, data results from those surveillance efforts, and maybe how it compares to what we saw last year? Because I think a lot of people are, based on my understanding of what people are saying they're seeing or not seeing, I think we're somewhat surprised that it hasn't apparently resurfaced yet, and hopefully it's not going to. But what are the surveillance efforts saying right now?
Yeah, that's a yet for sure. And I think we're happily surprised. I actually was bracing for a little bit worse in the spring. As our birds went down last winter, this disease spread through Central and South America. Many countries reporting high path for the first time, going through, and then of course hitting in a pretty large amounts in our South American partners in domestic and in wild birds. And in the spring, when those birds returned, we were kind of bracing for another wave of it, and that didn't really happen. Our surveillance year over year, so kind of looking at spring of 23 compared to the spring of 22, our surveillance numbers were around 7% last year, the 22 numbers, and then a little shy of 2% this year in the same populations being sampled. So it does seem like it had cooled down. Either the birds have a little bit more immunity or there's less virus or it's less virulent, but we certainly have not been picking it up as much, in this early spring to summer of 2023 as the year before, which is good news on all accounts.
Julie, I think I shared this with you. I was in Alaska earlier this summer as well, and we were at a brant colony, and we saw emperor geese there as well. And the one thing that we observed from quite a few of the nesting geese was this, what we thought was sort of a characteristic AI symptom of head shaking. And when they shook their head, they would fling mucus from their nares and from their mouth. But they continued to nest. It didn't interrupt their nesting. Whether that was AI, we won't know. But I did check in with the researchers at that camp kind of afterwards, because what we would have expected if there was kind of high prevalence of AI in that colony, you would have expected to see it first in the juvenile birds, right? Those newly produced young. But they were not seeing much, if any, indications of young birds that were affected or sick or dying from AI. So that's an optimistic bit of news. Again, most of what we'll talk about kind of outside this report and the data that you can provide from surveillance is anecdotal. But hey, that's kind of what's fun to talk about, right? So, I mean, what do you think, if you had to kind of handicap it in terms of where we are right now, what would you tell people to expect? Is there any reasonable, that's an impossible question, I imagine, because you're trying to predict something that is, at this point, likely impossible to do so.
You want the crystal ball answer for the fall?
Yeah.
Yeah. This virus has been a pretty good fit for our wild birds. Globally, we're greater than 2 years in Europe and Asia. We're about 1.5 years or so in North America. Usually, over time, viruses burn out, right? They kind of adapt, and our animal species come up with some immunity, and the virus goes away over time. I don't know that that's going to go away completely, but it does seem like we're seeing less and less detection. I would just caution that with, we certainly want our hunters to still remain vigilant. We want folks to comply. A lot of our surveillance in the fall, especially, is hunter harvest, so voluntary participation. So if your disease biologist approaches you and asks you for samples, that helps us get our numbers up and really helps us understand where disease is and is not. So we appreciate the help with that, and just helping us get our numbers up and make sure that we're looking everywhere we need to be. And then any reports of any die-offs, so we can look into those. And I would just be cautious, coming in, if you're in an area where the avian influenza has been detected in the past, be careful. Don't put things in your mouth when you're cleaning out birds. No smoking or eating or drinking anything that might, inoculate you. Be careful with your dog. Again, we haven't seen, thankfully, any real substantial risk of spillover into dogs, but I wouldn't say it's impossible. And just be careful, especially if you got backyard birds, chickens in your area or near any poultry industry. I mean, Arkansas is a very big poultry player. So, being careful that we're not the ones that are spreading the disease around on trucks or equipment or ATVs or anything like that. So just having hunters be kind of at the foreground of that safety and precaution is where I would hope that we're going, and we can all remain optimistic that this stays at a low level as it is right now.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Julie, and I appreciate you making the tie to those commercial and backyard poultry, because it's more than just an academic thing. I mean, this affects whenever egg prices skyrocketed several months ago, it was a surprise to a lot of people, but I made a comment to somebody. It's like, well, look, if folks had been listening to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, they would have known that this was going to have an effect on all of those facilities, and it was going to have a natural effect on the supply and then the prices. It certainly is multi-billion-dollar kind of impact on the poultry facilities. Backyard poultry owners, they're affected by this. So it's very important for us as duck hunters, because we're the ones out there in those wetlands interacting with those birds, to be aware of it and just to be aware of the risk that it poses. So,
well, I think it's a really good exercise for hunters to go through is go to the USDA website, do the search bar and look at avian influenza. You're right, of course. Hunters, right, are by far and away the number one reporting source for wild birds. But then that whole other column of domestic birds is the point at which you go, oh, this is a very serious thing, even though I'm not seeing it. We're talking about millions of domestic birds were killed here last year. What was the total number there? It's staggering, and the reason, right, that hunters are a big part of this is because we are traveling with birds. Like, the whole reason that I'm out there, other than keeping the dog happy, is I like to eat them. So we're a vector and moving disease around, and I think having a little bit better understanding of what the strong guidelines are for transportation. If we're truly just moving them to be eaten, and we know that the concerns aren't for getting other wild birds sick, but the concern is for getting domestic populations sick that could, absolutely put a producer out of business.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. It's a good point. Julie, I think you have agreed to stay on with us for a little bit. So if any of the rest of the panel have questions that may have occurred to you over the past year, I think Julie's willing to take those now.
I mean, there's a bunch. And like you mentioned, you Ducks Unlimited and several other organizations have released a lot of data that hunters need to know to be respectful, mindful on what to do, whether it's, can you eat them? Do you let your dog pick them up? Do you go home and play with your pet parrot? I mean, I think there's a lot of information out there, so I won't waste your time with this. But, I think it's important, from someone who travels a lot, like myself, whether it's Canada or Louisiana, California, it doesn't matter, East Coast, West Coast, and you're a hunter and you're exposed to these things, what is best practice for us to just get out there in open air? If I'm a hunter and I see avian influenza for the first time, regardless of species, let's just say it's snow geese, what's the right thing to do? Is harvesting the bird that's acting different the right thing to do? Do you leave it alone? Do you pick it up? Who do you call? Just putting that out there for everybody, because there's a lot of people that I know that were calling me like, I know what I'm talking about. Luckily Mike calls me or I bug him and say, hey man, what do I need to do? And I've got that outlet. But I think there's a lot of people out there that still don't understand the data-driven response to what do I do when I'm exposed to it.
Great question, and yeah, going back, the risk is to multiple different parties, right? So we're here talking to you all. We're trying to protect the poultry industry. We're trying to protect backyard folks, and they've been vigilant as well. I do a version of this talk to all these different groups, telling them avoid contact with waterfowl. Don't do anything to lure wild birds into your area. Clean up feed. But, wildlife management goes back to the State Department, the State Department of Wildlife. So they're going to be the first boots on the ground. Every single case isn't going to be investigated. There's just simply not the, the bandwidth or the manpower to get that done. And we're also cautious with our labs, the laboratory resources, that we're not submitting thousands and thousands. If there's a big die-off, we might sample 4 or 5, or if we already know it's in the area, those might not get sampled. So there's a list on our, and Mike, I know you've put it out there before, but we've got resources out there on how to contact your state game agency, how to report this, being really, really careful to not be that vector, not be that conduit of disease. So if you're in an area where the disease has been detected, I would be cautious enough to bring a change of clothes, right? You don't want to, especially if you've got backyard birds, you've got pet birds, your neighbors have chickens, or that kind of thing. You don't want to be the one to have virus on your boots, on your wheels, and potentially walk in the backyard and introduce it that way. So changing your boots is a pretty easy thing to do. It's not a big ask, and it might prevent a resurgence of the infection, and it's devastating consequence. Wild birds don't always die, but the domestic poultry and chickens, it's highly pathogenic in those birds. So we really don't want to go backwards. As you've said, it's tens of millions of domestic birds that we've lost in the last year and a half, and a lot of producers have taken a big hit on that. And we just want to be as careful as we can to avoid being that transmitter. We know wild birds have it. We don't need to spread it any further.
Sure. Yeah, and as Cal mentioned earlier, as waterfowl hunters, we're there to have a good time and harvest animals for consumption or for sport as consumption. But, we're at the forefront. We're the foot soldiers of being exposed to wild populations that have avian influenza, going among them. So being a steward of the sport as a hunter, as a conservationist, knowing what to do, educating yourself, being that person, because I highly doubt anyone who's not waterfowl hunting or taking pictures on a wildlife refuge is ever going to be exposed to a snow goose with avian influenza. So being that respectful steward of the sport with information that you guys have put together is important for everyone to know.
Yeah, and changing your boots is not a big ask.
Right.
But
it's not a big
for
ask.
a bunch of dudes sitting around the plucking table after a good morning hunt, not putting things in your mouth, oddly enough,
Right.
is a pretty tough ask.
Right.
But, we'll get that message out there.
My wife makes it clear I'm going to change my boots at some point after our hunt before I walk in the house. So I can probably handle changing my boots before I throw the boots in someone else's backyard chicken pen.
Yeah, there you go.
Take some Purell, the pumps of Purell that are available everywhere. Take that. Just get your hands cleaned up before you put anything in your mouth. It'll save everybody a little bit of heartache.
Sure. Great stuff.
Julie, thank you so much for your time tonight. You're welcome to stay on. You're welcome to drop off and watch the rest of this on YouTube like everybody else, whatever you would prefer. But we will definitely be in touch with you in the future and talk with you in more detail about all this stuff. So thanks so much, Julie.
Sounds good. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Julie.
Another reminder that if you want a little bit more information about avian flu, some of the resources that are out there, you can go to either the ducks.ca, that's DU Canada's website, or ducks.org, that's ours, and just search for avian flu, and that will take you to our page where we have a lot of resources, including links to USDA, NRCS, and a lot of those other resources. Matt?
Mike and our website, too, respectively, has some of those resources for Canadian hunters as well, which differ a little bit in terms of who manages that in Canada, but those resources are all available on our website, too, at ducks.ca.
At this point, I think we're ready to do the first prize giveaway, and let me see if I have this information here in front of me. I do. I am happy to, well, let me first, won't give you the name just yet. I'm going to tell you what the prize pack is. It includes 1 annual premium membership with OnX Hunt app, 1 DU Canada Gear YETI water bottle, 1 Drake Waterfowl Systems gift card for $100, 1 YETI Ducks coffee table book. I have not seen this book in person yet, but I've heard it's fantastic.
Really cool book. Really
and estimated total value of $255 US. Congratulations, Austin from Indiana. You will be receiving an email from us shortly. We're going to get your information on how to get this, all of these great resources to you. So congratulations, Austin. Remember, if you're just joining now and you want to participate in the rest of the package, the prize giveaways that we've got, you'll need to scan the QR code that'll be shown on the screen or click the link in the YouTube description for the event. I think we're ready to move on. And I think next up, we're going to talk about geese. We did this last year, and we didn't give geese a whole lot of attention. We've got a lot of stuff that we can kind of go back to. I mean, we blew through the duck numbers right at the start, and so we are going to come back to that. But we have guests joining us online. We wanted to stay on schedule with some of what they had tonight. So stay with us. We're going to come back and discuss duck numbers. But right now, we're going to add something else that was requested last year, which is a discussion about geese, how they fare. Some of like that report, the waterfowl status report, includes estimates from over a dozen, 15, 16 different species or subspecies of geese in North America, and Matt's going to give us a quick rundown.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mike. And so when we're thinking about our geese, we're mostly thinking about our dark geese and our light geese. And so our darks, a lot of them being our Canadas and the multiple different subspecies of our Canada geese. And so in terms of population numbers on those from this report, we saw some declines in those numbers that are out there for this year, but overall they're in that 5-7% range. Nothing really too concerning there in terms of natural variation that we expect in some of those populations. And for our light geese, there's some little bit more variation that we see across the board there. Some of our mid-continent snow geese have been declining and shown some trends of decline for the previous few years. And those populations of geese are populations that are susceptible to some weather conditions a little bit more on the breeding ground. So when you get cold snaps of weather, lots of precipitation, that can result in really low gosling recruitment in those years. And so that means that production's low. We see low populations ultimately for those species. But we do know from some anecdotal reports from this year of folks that are up banding geese and working on geese that some of the productivity across the Arctic seems to be relatively good this year, and in some cases reports of above average production. And so that's really encouraging for some of our light geese as well as our Canadas. And there are some areas that are below, and so we do see that variation. And Mike, I know that you were, the areas I'm talking about, I guess, are more from the Eastern Arctic, and so I know you were up in the Western Arctic and might have some anecdotes from that area.
I did. I spoke with Jordan Thompson, who's a PhD student out at Colorado State. He was the one that was leading the research station up there this year at the Chautauqua River Camp as long-term branch study site, and I spoke with him recently to get the latest update, and he told me that last year was a bit of a tough year. I think partly related to avian influenza. This year was a better year in terms of productivity. He gave me a couple of, he thinks, it's really difficult to get final numbers on all this kind of stuff, and he probably at those research sites has as good of an idea as anyone because he can actually compare the data. We can say much of that Alaska area was delayed this spring. That's usually bit of a challenge for geese because they have such a narrow window within which to complete that nesting activity. Jordan told me that nesting had a really strong nesting effort, and the number of nests they found this year, I think, was a bit up from last year. He said nest success was very high. He said normally at that in that area for the brant, apparent nest success is around 68%, which is incredibly high, when compared to ducks. Most of us are going to be familiar with ducks, but for geese, it's higher. This year, nest success was 86%. So that's pretty good at that site. And he said that was, I think, mostly related to a lack of fox in that particular area. That was an area that was affected by that typhoon last year. Whether that kind of knocked back those predators, I mean, that's one of the hypotheses. He also said, however, that there was another colony a bit farther south that had lower nest success, more foxes. So that's another example of how you can talk to one or two different people from sites that are very close to one another. They're going to see different estimates of production, have different breeding success, and so forth. But sounds like it was better this year. They did get a lot of young birds in their banding, at least at that site. So that's a good thing. That's better than saying it was impaired by AI, the way it was last year.
Yeah, and I think also important to note, I mean, a lot of those are kind of qualitative estimates right now. We don't have strong numbers on those, and as you said, that's something that comes into focus as we kind of move along here, and that a lot of those banding crews are just back this weekend or this last week here coming out of the Arctic. So
you don't like geese at all, do you? Surely you don't have a question, right?
It's an equal opportunity environment with geese, but you know where my heart lays with greater white-fronted goose, speckled-bellied geese. So tell me about what's going on. I've been begging you. Told me I had to wait. What's it looking like?
I'm going to have to go to the graph here. I will be honest and say that white fronts are not my strong suit in terms of what I know about. I'm actually looking at this right here. They're actually doing some estimation now. One using a fall index, predicted fall index from Pacific population of white fronts. The mid-continent population of greater white fronts is now estimated using a Lincoln method. Now, what I can tell you, I can actually show you that right now. Over the long term, that mid-continent population of greater white fronts is up, and so it looks as though the most recent estimate that they have there, which is probably going to be, I think, for last year, whenever they do the Lincoln estimate, it generates a fall estimate, but it has to go back a year. I believe I'm right on that. So it appears that it was up last year, and I can probably actually find this here. No, it's not in that. But yeah, that's a different one. That's a little more. Some of these populations of geese are much more difficult to survey. Sure. Some of the data come from the waterfowl breeding population and habitat survey, the aerial survey. Others are estimated using this Lincoln-Peterson estimator, which relies on accurate estimates of harvest, total harvest. It also relies on good reporting of band recoveries from harvested geese in this case. So overall, that white front population appears to still be healthy in that mid-continent, which is the one that you would be most interested in. Looking at a fall estimate of about 3 million, if I'm kind of ballparking this, which appears to be kind of in line with what we've seen for the past few years. But the graph that I'm showing Brooke here that everybody else can't see has some pretty big error bars on it too, right? Sure. So that's why it's the more data we get from hunters, whether in the form of harvest, in the form of band recoveries, or the band reporting, I should say, the more precision we can get around our estimates. Some of that gets into some statistical issues, but the key message is if you harvest a bird with a band, report it. And if you're asked to participate in a harvest survey, do so. Those data now are increasingly important for estimating population sizes of some of these goose populations.
Really cool bird, too. You know where my heart is, but growing up in South Louisiana, that's what we had. Now living in Western Kentucky, it's really interesting to see how many birds are there now. They're wintering in Western Kentucky. Should I be saying this out loud?
That's up to
Everybody
you, man.
Stay home. Don't come spectate in Kentucky. No, but seriously, whether it's, the East Coast, Indiana, all these states that otherwise have never seen, any sort of dense population of specks, it's showing up. So you can certainly tell through my travels, and I'm sure other people's experience, that a healthy population of birds is one that's going to indicate showing up in new areas and not disappearing from everywhere. So really, really exciting for us spec lovers. We're cool. We're good.
Cal, do you go after geese very much? Are you an equal opportunity hunter as well?
I am, for sure. Growing up,
outside of shovelers, because you've already kind of revealed that.
Only birds that we were allowed to hunt.
Yeah, That's right. You told me.
Yeah.
In Montana, right?
Yeah, in Montana. Yep. So that's how I learned how to hunt was only for Canada geese, and ducks were below.
Yeah.
They were second tier, second class citizen. I love them all. Corned goose, pastrami, lots of different goose recipes. I can make them disappear pretty quick. I do not like plucking them though. Anyway, I have a question, and Virginia, you may be able to help on this as well, but that gosling survival rate, is that benefited at times by a slight population reduction? So those nesting grounds aren't as densely packed with nests? Or are they like a predator swamping type of survival strategy where it's always the more goslings running around, the better?
I can take a bit of a crack at that. In some cases, I know, and again, I'm not up on these populations. I don't spend time at the goose camps. That a lot of these, there's a lot of folks that spend an awful lot of time and know an awful lot about goose ecology more than I do. But my understanding of some of the density dependence that we see in those populations, it's what we call when we're thinking about the population size and potentially some of that gosling survival, is that there is some benefits potentially to some of those populations that have declined, where we see some recovery in some of the grazing grounds or the food that's available for some of those species on where those birds are being produced. And so we have more lush vegetation, potential higher nutritional value vegetation on some of those populations that have seen declines from their peaks. I think some of them peaked in the early 2010s for some of those, especially the snow geese colonies. And so there is some changes. I understand that happened there, but there's also some changes too in terms of some of those colonies and how they're working and where they are located in the Arctic, and the predators that are there, and new predators that are moving in. In some cases, I think I was reading about bald eagles in terms of encroachment on some of those colonies and changing dynamics that are happening there too. So it's sort of it's a complex puzzle, and things are changing as you know, we have a little bit of a change in breeding conditions and where those birds are moving to. But certainly there's some evidence, I think, to suggest that yes, as those populations come back maybe from those highs,
it's going to be a banger year for Canada geese. If you're out there calling, you're going to have a 5 or 6% reduction in the educated adult population. And we're going to have a lot more goslings looking to take an easy rest and an easy feed someplace.
Well,
Cal and I are on the same page. He likes hunting shovelers. He's an equal opportunist hunter, and he understands that hunting uneducated birds is a whole lot more inviting for the average guy. And we're hunters. I mean, we want all birds to do well, and we're conservationists. But Cal's onto something there. You know,
I agree.
But in addition to that, you know, those population numbers, again, as I kind of mentioned, geese are also going to be susceptible to those weather conditions. And so it's not just about what that ultimate population size is there. You've got to have, you know, those weather conditions, again, just like prairie ducks do. We need the water on the landscape. They need the right weather and the right timing for the food to be there for those goslings to get big and be able to tolerate those cold temperatures that might hit during the breeding season, so that they can make it into the fall flight.
Sure, just because they make it out of the egg doesn't mean they're going to make it all the way down here.
Which has most often been the cause of current declines, is that they don't make it to flight.
Yep. Got it.
That was driven home by Jordan whenever I was talking to him earlier. He said that, we had good nesting effort, good nest success, good apparent kind of recruitment as indexed by the number of young per adult that they captured during the breeding or during the banding operations. But he did note that brood rearing period was characterized by some pretty cold weather, some pretty rainy weather, and it just reminds you that, man, those birds have it tough, and it did I guess sort of reinforce for me that it doesn't take a whole lot to take an otherwise good year and eliminate all that production that was once on the ground if you get really, really poor conditions. But it sounded like that despite that cooler weather, despite that rainy weather, his sense was, he didn't actually have the numbers yet, but his sense was that production there on that colony was good. So I also have to kind of go back, Brooke, to what you were asking me about in terms of that mid-continent estimate. I was close. That Lincoln estimate is, according to this right here, the number is for this year, 2 years prior. You know, for example, this 3.1 million, which is going to be the fall estimate for white fronts, was from 2 years ago. That's again that Lincoln Peterson estimator thing. It kind of takes a couple of years to get some of that data to really increase the precision around that estimate. But 3 million, you'll take that as a fall estimate, right?
You know, depending on what state I'm hunting in, I can't shoot 3 million, so I see that as a bunch of opportunity on the table, and I'm going to measure my success based off of the amount of opportunity out there. It looks like there's plenty of it.
Yep. Let's see. Anything else on geese, Matt? I mean, their populations overall remain, with a few notable exceptions, quite healthy.
Yeah, I think that pretty much covers it.
Yeah. And we'll wrap up here as we get a little bit farther, talking about all these numbers, just breeding population numbers that we've been given to you thus far. Sure. The production during this summer is really, really important in terms of determining what you're going to see, potentially going to see. There's a whole lot of other factors that go into whether you're going to be successful in the blind, right? So let's see, where are we here? We've got, I think we're probably ready just to have a discussion about that very thing. I'm curious. So either of you guys, not from actually, Cal, you have a biology background.
No, I don't, but my mother would be happy to hear that.
I thought you did. Well,
no.
I learned something.
No, okay. I talked to you folks quite a bit.
Okay.
Yes. All
right. So did either of you guys, we talked to Jimbo Ronquist last year as a guest on this show, and this is a report that he always looked forward to, and my question to him was, what does the report mean to you? How do you get excited about it, or do you recognize that it is just one piece of information that's going to dictate what you might experience in the fall?
Yeah, Cal, if you don't mind, I'll go first because I'm sure you'll have a much better answer than I because you're a biologist apparently. but yeah, I mean, you know, I'm 30. I'll be 32 this month, and I'm a young guy, but I remember just waiting for these numbers to come out as a teenager, whether it was high school or between now and then, before my career in the outdoor industry. This was everything, but it's not. It's really not. Whenever I look at this, it's like I mentioned earlier, there's 32 million ducks, just the ones that are mentioned here out there, just because one or two of them are down.
In the spring.
In spring. Just because one or two are down by, a very small amount in percentage, whether it's 2% or 18%, that doesn't mean that where I hunt, what I do, I'm going to see 18% less ducks. It's not a direct correlation to my individual situation's harvest rate. Yeah. Yes, I'm excited about this because we all want to see things doing well, and there are winners here. The pintail. There's some that are doing good. Shoveler, just going to throw that out there. But it's an opportunity for us to not only be successful because we still have this amount of birds out there, but it's an opportunity for us to learn from these birds, and it tells us what to do between now and next year. So, yes, I get excited about it, but like you mentioned, it's one piece, and if there's anything I could just convey out there to the person that doesn't necessarily understand nor care about the dynamic, they're just a hunter and they want to know what's going on, and this may be their Bible. There's a whole lot more out there. This is a cool, exciting piece, and there's a lot of cool information, but it's a small portion of it. And, age of birds, whenever they make it down the flyway, is a major factor. Your environment where you hunt, if your farmer plants sugarcane instead of rice now, I don't think these numbers are going to affect you as much as your farmer deciding not to flood your crawfish pond or planting it in sugarcane. There's a lot of other factors out there. So it's exciting, both positive and negative. And, Cal, I'd love to hear what you have to say on it, but it's a cool piece of information that a lot of people and a lot of organizations have spent tons of time and effort to compile for us to form our own opinion on and determine where we decide to put our effort.
I think, very well said. I think it's great information to have. Is this going to dictate my season?
There you go.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, did you check the weather before you went out? It's like, it doesn't matter because I'm just going to go anyway.
Yeah. Right.
So, the dog deserves to go out, and I'm going to take her out. So what we see in the field can be reinforced by some of these numbers. So if I'm out in the marsh, on the river, on the lake, and I consistently see that mallards are down in my region, or you know, there are no ringbills flying around. I can absolutely make the decision to focus on other species and ignore the handful that I see come in, because these numbers are now reinforcing what I am seeing out there.
Yep.
And then maybe I'll have that one big day where the mallards are everywhere and they're landing in my lap, and I can get a limit to take home. Ideally right at the very end of the season, so I can have my federal maximum allowable possession limit to carry me through the winter. But I'm going to be out no matter what. You know, that's waterfowl hunting. It's kind of like turkeys. There's no better way to wake up than watching the sun come up and being out there and doing some freezing and doing a little bit of sweating too, and seeing what every storm front brings in and weather change brings in, and it's awesome. I'm getting excited for it right now. I love the fact that these numbers exist because of the things that Virginia talked about, and because of the things that Mark talked about, where we can look at these long-term data points and say, this correlates to farming practices in this region, this correlates to drought in this region. You know, we don't know what this correlates to, so let's gather this stuff back up and see what changes happened, or if nothing changed. Maybe things stayed the same for too long. And I love the fact that, you know, we're funding this, and it may not pertain to how I behave every day in the field, but it absolutely is that kind of Bible that you can point back to and say, hey, all this stuff exists, so we know that we aren't going to go back in history and repeat some mistakes.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, very good. Virginia, I want to ask you, you know, we talked about the Alaska Yukon Territory number being down when you look at total ducks this year by 50%. Is that going to affect whether you go out and hunt ducks this year?
Not a bit.
I know better than that, right?
Yeah, not a bit. And we'll see what that data really means, you know, as far as some limitations on the survey. But no, I mean, you know, the conditions down here in California are going to be excellent. You know, they're just going to be excellent compared to where we've been. You know, we've had about 500,000 acres of rice got planted this year. Most of the wetlands were able to get summer irrigation, so seed production should be pretty good. And, you know, our reservoirs at this point, they are currently more than 100% of their historical levels. It's, you know, it's a great situation. So that means that wetlands and rice lands are going to get surface water. There's going to be plenty of surface water delivered. So we should have, you know, the table set this fall. There'll be a lot of water, a lot of habitat on the landscape. Now that alone doesn't equate to hunting success. But, you know, it's exciting after coming out of that drought. And like I said, I've never seen anything that dismal in my life here in the valley. So it's just exciting to see the land recover, you know, and to look forward to what is to come this fall.
Appreciate that, Virginia. I'm going to take a quick break right here and announce that we have drawn for our second prize package. It includes 4 Ducks Unlimited podcast hats, 2 of which you can no longer get. They are out of production at this moment. 2 brand new Ducks Unlimited podcast decals, 1 annual premium membership with the Onyx Hunt app, 1 Ducks Unlimited Canada Gear YETI water bottle, 1 Drake Waterfowl Systems gift card for $100, and 1 YETI Ducks coffee table book, estimated value $285 US, 385 Canadian. And our winner on that one is Sam from Alberta. Congratulations, Sam. We will be getting
living in Alberta and winning.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. We will be getting in touch with you by way of email on how we can get that to you. We got 1 more to go here tonight, and then 3 more tomorrow. Let's see. Where do we want to go next?
Are they already hunting in Alberta? They're like, right? Isn't the season open?
A little bit.
Yeah.
Oh, for waterfowls?
Yeah.
I don't think so.
Getting close.
September 1st.
Yeah.
September 1st,
1,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Don't quote me on that for Alberta, but I think September 1.
Yeah, it's getting close though. You can smell it. I do want to take a moment to talk about adaptive harvest management. That's one of the very first questions. In this, I don't want us to just kind of forget about this mallard number. 18%, down 18% from last year, down 23% from the long-term average. We've talked about why that might not be unreasonable when you look at the long string of some degree of prairie drought that we've had, especially across Canada. You and I were looking at some maps earlier, and it's year after year of some abnormally dry or extreme drought. 21 was just dust across much of that landscape. So, and sometimes it takes a few years, as we've talked about, for those populations to kind of rebound. But the first question I got was, what does this mean that we're going to be going into a restrictive or moderate season? One thing to remember is that the way harvest regulations are set now, and Ducks Unlimited does not get involved in harvest regulations, nor does Ducks Unlimited Canada, but we read the reports. We stay up to date on the policies and procedures and how that works because our members care so much about it, and we feel like it's our duty to at least be able to tell a little bit about how it works. And we also say we're not involved in the decision-making process. But when you read that AHM report, it tells you that, and you can talk about how Canada is set here. It's different from the states. The numbers that we're talking about this year are used to influence or to set regulations next year, the 24-25 season. That's a change that was made a few years ago. The regulations that are in place for this year, the 23-24 hunting season, are not going to change. When you look through that report, where all these numbers fall relative within those AHM models and the harvest packages, you would conclude that those models are recommending no change to harvest regulations for next year. And I don't think I'm saying anything that's not in print there, and Mark alluded to it. Now, there are other things that happen between that report and when those regulations get set. The Flyway Councils and their tech sections are meeting this week. The Mississippi Flyway Council tech section is meeting in Eureka Springs, Arkansas. Pacific Flyway, I think, is also meeting this week or getting started. The states engage in those discussions through those Flyway Councils. They make a recommendation, and then those recommendations are almost all the time now, as Mark said, based on those optimal regulatory packages identified in those AHM harvest frameworks. And when you look at them, it recommends no changes from what's in place this year. But that's just the recommendations. So stay tuned. Engage with your state waterfowl managers. They're your primary conduit to that regulatory setting process here in the States. Great people out there. They're working hard for this resource and representing your interests. So make sure you engage where you have the opportunities. How's it work in Canada?
Yeah, so a little bit different in Canada, but there's a lot of parallels there too. So in Canada, there's a reporting every 2 years, so we can expect a new population status report for Canada here this fall. It's supposed to come out probably late fall. Following that, there's proposed regulations that get posted. Those are then open for comment. Those are influenced by the various provinces, working with the federal government as well to set those regulations. Those get reviewed, and then ultimately the regulations get posted in about July each year. So that's how our system works, and then that happens for 2-year cycles. So there's some time in between there. And so again, they don't just look at 1 year and make decisions based on that 1 year worth of data. There's usually some data that goes into it, and long-term pieces of data as well that they use. So
we got a rapid fire. We're going to do a few rapid fire Q&A from the audience. They've provided us with a few questions, and so we're going to answer a couple of these. This one is from DU Canada. How optimistic are you about the pintail numbers? Can we be cautiously hopeful for a recovery over the coming years? Matt, you want to take that one?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in terms of optimism, it's always encouraging to see response or increases in the population. But just as we discussed, we're not too worried about the mallard numbers in terms of seeing those declines. I don't think we can get too high on opportunities when we see that response there either. We know that pintails, in order to respond in the prairie potholes, at least, they still need that water to come back as well. And so we're going to hope to see that water come back eventually to really hopefully boost pintails. And some of the work we do at Ducks Unlimited Canada, continuing to try to put habitat on the landscape that benefit pintails through some of our programs, whether that's putting winter wheat into production. And we've seen an increase and an uptake in a lot of that program that, reduces that mechanical destruction of those nests, provides better nesting habitat for pintails to increase their nest survival. So continue to do work like that. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I think we're really going to have to wait until the water comes back on the prairies to see some strong responses and multiple years of increases for the pintail recovery.
I have another question here. It says, regarding peak seasonal temporary wetland productivity, would it be reasonable to expect a fairly flat line of production and breeding until spring of 24, 3 years post rewatering of the prairies? I think what I would clarify there is I don't know that we can consider the prairies to be fully rewatered right now. We talk to people in Canada and they say it is dry again across much of that prairie landscape. Sure. Now, we have heard reports of good duck production out of the Dakotas this year. What that materializes into, I don't know. We do know from some of the harvest age ratios from last year that there was production across the prairies last year. I mean, it wasn't off the charts. Some areas were better than others. I think we're going to see much the same this year, but I don't think we can be looking for peak productivity across that broad landscape for a couple more years, and that would even be assuming we get those wet conditions across that broad landscape.
Well, and nor do we expect that, right?
Yeah.
The prairies are characterized by this, where we're going to have a few of those years where we have those bumper crops, and the rest of the time it's kind of just average in terms of those, and that's why a lot of those populations, when you look at them, there's increases and declines over time, and those generally reflect those conditions in those habitats.
Great question.
Yeah.
You guys said it all.
We are quickly running out of time here. We got a couple more questions here in the feed, but anything from you fellas?
Oh boy, if you're a producer, an agricultural producer, like we talked about a couple of times here, we have these intermittent wetlands, low spots in your field. Boy, what I've seen turn those things into habitat meccas that still can produce a paycheck every now and again is finding appropriate easements, either through the state or the federal level, to put those into native grasses typically. So we're not talking about this situation where it's been farmed, it's been tilled, and then you get a nice wet year. That intermittent wetland is no longer intermittent. Now it's a pond, but it's not growing anything.
That Wings Over Water documentary was incredible. The IMAX series that DU partnered with, it was a really cool story. That South Dakota, correct?
It goes back to the prairie pothole region. I don't exactly remember where those birds settle.
Same exact thing. This farmer decided to go back to the way the farm was whenever he inherited it from his family and was yielding higher crops and created waterfowl habitat. So it was really cool. But yeah, I 100% agree with that. It's a big deal.
Well, in Cal, a lot of our program delivery that we do with Ducks Unlimited Canada and the prairies is just that. So we have things like conservation easements that go on land, but we also have our programs like our marginal areas program, which is doing just that, of looking to turn marginal land into planting that into forage that benefits ducks, but then also can be used for forage for cattle and those types of things. So
yeah, a lot of times you can still graze it or do a couple of cuttings of grass, hay, or whatever it is. So marginal for some, very beneficial for the ducks and for us.
Cal, I got a question that I want to direct towards you, and then we can weigh in on it, and you from a Canadian perspective. What is the most successful government policy, besides just funding, that we've observed that has been directly linked to a rise in the duck population? I got an answer for that.
It's got to be CRP, right?
There you go.
Conservation Reserve Program out of the Farm Bill.
Yep.
Yes, wetlands are important. Ducks like to be wet. Everybody knows that, but they nest in the grass.
Yep. Yeah, and importantly, 2023 is a year of the Farm Bill renewal. Are you engaging in any of that through any of your channels?
Typically just report on what the change is and talk about, just another acronym, CRP, and how the Farm Bill isn't just for farmers.
Oh, right. That's right. That's right. Our Ducks Unlimited policy staff are heavily engaged in that discussion. We're going to have an episode coming out here soon with Julia Peebles and Zach Hartman, our Chief Policy Officer, Farm Bill. That entire episode dedicated to the Farm Bill,
Really cool.
what our priorities are, where we stand on that, and most likely asking our members and supporters to engage and let their congressmen and women know what they want to see in that Farm Bill. What about from a Canadian perspective?
Well, in terms of ensuring we protect duck habitat, North American Wetlands Conservation Act is a pretty important piece of legislation, and that exists there to help us deliver habitat in Canada. And then our provinces are enacting now, and our policy teams working hard with a lot of folks, and whether that be advancing new sustainable agricultural programs within our country, or also in terms of putting wetland policies into place in a lot of provinces that also help to retain habitat on the landscape. So that's probably some of the more useful things that are going on right now.
We're going to move quickly to the third prize pack. We got a little delayed on these, but that's okay. We're going to get them all in. This is the prize pack number 3, consisting of 1 annual premium membership with the OnX Hunt app, 1 Chêne Gear Hydrolock field bib, and 1 Chêne Gear Hydrolock shell jacket. Estimated total value $999 US and 1,350 Canadian. And our winner on that one, Frank from Louisiana. Frank, we're going to get in touch with you get your information on how we can get this to you. I think we're going to be talking with you about the sizes and camo pattern, all that kind of stuff. Is that right? We're going to get all that figured out. Yep, we're going to get all that figured out. So look for an email. Frank from Louisiana. Where are we now? We're almost to the end, fellas. What have we missed? I mean, we could talk about a whole bunch of this stuff.
I've learned a lot.
Right?
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of people are going to be a bit disappointed that we didn't talk about eastern mallards, black ducks, and maybe even Great Lakes mallards, and maybe even blue-winged teal. Couldn't get to it all. But
don't worry, we're going to post up Mike Brasher's personal cell phone number for you guys to call in.
No, we're not. Yeah, the reminder would be that this is just one set of data, right? It's incredibly important for a lot of reasons. We are very thankful to our state, federal partners that make it happen. It's really important to us. It's important to us, from the conservation decisions that we make. We see these numbers down for some species. And while those annual changes are influential in harvest regulations, and that kind of annual decision, at least in the States, it's a couple of years in Canada, from a conservation perspective, for both of our organizations, and Cal, for a lot of the ones that you support as well, and Brooke, you, and all of us, we realize that conservation is a long game. The results from one survey, whether it's habitat related or whether it's population related, aren't going to cause us to turn on a dime and all of a sudden react and do something dramatic. We realize these are wild populations and wild systems, and we understand also that there's uncertainty in some of these surveys. Well, there's uncertainty around every one of these estimates, right? And we have to take that into account. We look over the long term. We look at these for trends. We try to relate those trends to changes in environmental conditions, habitat conditions, try to identify the policy and conservation program activities that we can do to address those. We lean heavily on our university partners, our graduate students, our federal and state researchers. They're critical in all this. This survey, seeing some of these numbers, despite the success that we've had with waterfowl over the past 30, 40 years, them being the one group of bird that we point to repeatedly as having increased since the 1970s, in contrast to a lot of the other groups of birds. Despite those successes, this is an important reminder that these birds do fluctuate. We know they fluctuate in response to the condition of the habitats, and the condition of those habitats is dictated by more than just environmental conditions. It's all the other landscape changes that we've talked about, and why it's important that we put policies and programs out there that are attractive and that do the right things for the ducks. But I've said enough for me. What else we got in closing?
Looking forward to the season. Now we get to go out there and ground proof all this stuff.
There you go.
Yeah, we got to make sure, field tests, we just got to make sure that some of this is correct, and we'll follow back up and let you know how accurate it is here soon.
Yeah, and the fun is in the variables, not in the knowing. So
for sure,
got to go figure it out.
Yeah, Mike, I think Virginia made a really excellent connection earlier when we're thinking about, a lot of the water back on the landscape in California right now, and it's a lot of that work in terms of restoration and retention work that happens in those landscapes that then allow us to see that productivity bump or those increases in the populations, and it's the same in Prairie Canada. A lot of the restoration retention work that we're doing there right now is for when it does get wet again. We're going to be optimistic that we can see that bump in productivity and ultimately create some really, really good fall flights in the years to come when the water's there.
Exciting.
Very exciting. Brooke, I hope to catch up with you sometime in the field this fall. Cal, Matt, I'd love to do the same with you, but we'll see how it goes, right? That's a little bit farther than where this fella here hunts.
I don't know. He knows what to do, so we might have to hop on an airplane and go catch up with Cal.
Yeah. Virginia, final comments from you as well.
Yeah, I would just echo that from a conservation perspective, it's so important to keep the potential on the landscape because these conditions will be good and they'll be bad and it will ebb and flow. But if we lose that land base, we lose the potential for the birds to take advantage of the situation when conditions are good. So, it is about conservation easements. It's about restoration and enhancement. And it's just keeping the potential there, keeping the table set, so when the conditions do flash on, we can get that good response that we need.
I think that's a good place to end it. Cal, thank you so much for joining us. You made the trip all the way from Montana. I hope you had a great 2 days while you were here. It was fantastic. Spent some time with you.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been great.
Matt, it's always great to catch up with you. You're going to be around for another day, so we have a few other things that we'll get into. Appreciate you being here. Appreciate DU Canada supporting you being here. Appreciate everything that DU Canada has done as part of this. Brooke, same with you. Appreciate it, man.
Always a pleasure. Anytime.
Also, we'll thank our other guest, Julie Lennox, who joined us earlier, and Mark Koneff. We greatly appreciate them taking time out of their busy schedule and sharing some insights from federal agency perspectives. Now is the time where I also run down the list of everybody else that helped make this happen, which was a huge undertaking. I'm thankful to all of them. From DU Canada, Carolyn Koshaluk, Justin Franzak, Eli Wimet, Chad Evans, Ashley Lewis. Here from Ducks Unlimited Incorporated, Mallory Murphy, Chris Isaac, Bobby Meeks, Clay Baird, Tyler Katzma, Jennifer Yates, Alexis Roden, Zach Eskelman, Katie Burke, Beth Bryan, Scott Anderson, Tim Farringer, Kai Victor, and my wife even came in and helped with the set here. So thanks to her as well. And thank you all for joining. Thank you for spending your time here tonight. And thanks for supporting Wetlands and Waterfowl Conservation. There will be 3 other packages mailed out to gifts, prizes awarded tomorrow. So look for your email. Maybe you'll be one of the lucky winners. Thanks, everybody. Have a great hunting season.